He could have kept the money, and no one would have known. But his act shocked even the basketball legend himself. When the poor boy found Big Shaq's wallet, he didn't know that one simple decision would change his life forever. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, share this video with your friends, and write in the comments where you're watching from. It was one of those afternoons when the heat lingered in the air long after the sun had started its slow descent toward the horizon. The streets of the neighborhood carried their usual hum of activity. Old cars with peeling paint rumbled over cracked asphalt. Street vendors called out their offers, and the occasional sound of children laughing echoed from alleyways between tightly packed buildings. Dust swirled in the golden light as people moved through their routines, many of them too tired from the day's work to notice much beyond their immediate concerns. Juan walked the familiar path home, his worn-out sneakers scuffing against the uneven sidewalk. His school bag, frayed at the edges, hung heavily on his shoulder, filled with books that felt more like a burden than a gateway to the future. His mind, however, wasn't on his homework or the lessons of the day. Instead, his thoughts revolved around the same worries that had occupied him for as long as he could remember. His mother, Lucia, worked tirelessly to provide for him and his younger sister, Carla. She held down 2 low-paying jobs, cleaning houses during the day and working the register at a small convenience store at night. Even with all her effort, money was never enough. Their apartment, a cramped space with walls that seemed to close in a little more each day, barely provided shelter from the elements. The heater had been broken for months. The fridge was never fully stocked, and the rent was a constant worry. Juan had long ago accepted the reality of their life, but that didn't mean he didn't wish for something better. Sometimes, when he walked past shop windows displaying new shoes or stacks of neatly folded clothes, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to have things without having to calculate their cost in hours of his mother's labor. He never voiced these thoughts out loud. His mother had enough on her shoulders without him adding to her worries, but they lingered all the same. As he turned the corner near the main street, his eyes caught something unusual on the ground. A wallet, thick and made of black leather, lay just off the curb, partially hidden in the shade of a bench. For a moment, he hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed it. People walked by, indifferent, too wrapped up in their own lives to pay attention. He bent down and picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hands. A quick look inside sent his heart pounding. It was filled with cash, more money than he had ever seen in one place before. Crisp $100 bills were stacked inside, along with credit cards, a driver's license, and a couple of personal photographs. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through the contents. His mind raced through all the things this money could do for his family. They could finally pay off the overdue rent. His mother could take a break, even if just for a little while. Carla could get new shoes instead of wearing hand-me-downs with worn soles. Then he saw the name on the driver's license, Shaquille O'Neal. The name sounded familiar. He furrowed his brow, trying to recall where he had heard it before. Then it clicked. Shaq, the famous basketball player, the man from commercials, the towering figure in sports, the one people always talked about with admiration. Juan swallowed. This wasn't just anyone's wallet. For a long moment, he stood there, staring at the wallet in his hands, the weight of the decision pressing against his chest. The money inside could change so much for his family. It was more than his mother made in months. It was enough to make things easier, to lift at least some of the burdens they carried. But it wasn't his. The thought came to him with quiet certainty. No matter how much he needed it, No matter how tempting it was, the money didn't belong to him. If he kept it, he would always know that he had taken something that wasn't his to take. His mother had always told him that honesty was what made a person truly rich. Not money, not things, but the knowledge that they had done the right thing even when no one was watching. His grip on the wallet tightened as he exhaled slowly. He had already made his decision. By the time he reached his apartment, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the small living room where Carla sat on the floor, coloring in a book with half-broken crayons. Their mother stood by the stove, stirring a pot of soup that smelled more like boiled water than anything else. She turned when she heard the door and offered him a tired smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes anymore. Without a word, Juan placed the wallet on the table. Lucia frowned, wiping her hands on a rag before stepping closer. "What's this?" "I found it," Juan said, his voice steady. "It belongs to someone famous." She opened it carefully, her eyes widening as she took in the money inside. Then she looked up at him, searching his face. "You didn't take anything?" He shook his head. Lucia's gaze softened, and for a moment, the exhaustion in her features seemed to fade. She reached out and rested a hand on his cheek, her fingers warm and slightly calloused from years of hard work. "I'm proud of you," she said. That night, as Juan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he wondered what would happen next. He had done the right thing, but would it even matter? Would anyone care? The wallet was still sitting on the table, waiting to be returned to its rightful owner. The wallet sat untouched on the table, its presence filling the small apartment with a strange kind of tension. Even Carla, usually oblivious to the worries of the grown-up world, sensed that something was different. She peeked at it curiously from the floor, her coloring book forgotten as she watched her mother and brother in silence. Lucia had barely spoken after Juan had told her how he found it. She had only nodded, her expression unreadable, before returning to the stove. Now, as she set down 2 bowls of soup, she finally sat across from him, folding her hands together. "You're sure it belongs to that basketball player?" Juan nodded. His ID was inside. Shaquille O'Neal. Lucia let out a slow breath and looked at the wallet again. The weight of it was not just physical, it carried with it a choice, a test of character, and an unspoken temptation. "We could use that money," she said quietly. It wasn't a statement of intent, just an acknowledgement of reality. "I know," Juan admitted, staring down at his soup. The liquid was thin, more broth than anything substantial, with only a few pieces of vegetables floating in it. It was the kind of meal they had grown used to. Lucia ran a hand through her hair. "You understand that some people wouldn't return it, right? They'd say that if someone like him lost a wallet full of cash, he wouldn't even notice it was gone. That he has so much already, while others—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Juan knew the argument well. It was the kind of reasoning people in their neighborhood used when explaining why they sometimes took what they needed to survive. Life had never been fair to them, so why should they play by rules designed to keep them struggling? But he also knew his mother. Even if she let those thoughts cross her mind, even if she recognized the bitter truth of their circumstances, she'd never been the kind of person to take what wasn't hers. She looked at Juan, searching his face. "And you still want to return it?" "Yes," he said firmly. Lucia studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, then we'll find a way." They had no phone of their own. Their landline had been cut off months ago when they couldn't afford the bill, and Lucia's old cell phone had stopped working long before that. But they did have their neighbor, Doña Maria, who sometimes let them borrow hers for emergencies. Juan and his mother walked to her apartment that evening. The elderly woman opened the door with her usual warm smile, a shawl draped over her shoulders despite the lingering heat of the day. "Lucia, mijo," she greeted them, stepping aside to let them in. "Everything all right?" Lucia hesitated, glancing down at Juan. "We need to use your phone for something important." Doña Maria gave them a curious look but nodded, retrieving an old but well-kept smartphone from the small table by her armchair. "Go ahead." Juan sat down and carefully typed in the name he had seen on the ID card. He wasn't sure where to start. Famous people like Shaquille O'Neal didn't exactly have their personal phone numbers listed for anyone to find. But after some searching, he found a website connected to his management team. There was a contact form, a number for media inquiries, and a general business email. Lucia leaned over his shoulder, reading along. "Try the phone number," she suggested. With slightly trembling hands, Juan dialed. The phone rang twice before an automated message played, instructing him to leave a message. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. Hi, my name is Juan, and I live in—" He stopped himself before saying his full address. "I, found something that belongs to Shaquille O'Neal. A wallet. I want to return it. Please call back if this is the right number." He hung up and stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Lucia squeezed his shoulder. "You did good." Doña Maria, who had been listening, finally asked, "What is it that you're trying to return?" Lucia hesitated, but Juan spoke up. "A wallet. A really expensive one. It has a lot of money in it." The old woman's eyebrows lifted slightly. "And you're returning it?" "Yes." A small, approving smile touched her lips. "Your mama raised you right." They thanked her and went home, where the wallet still sat on the table, waiting. Juan barely slept that night. He kept thinking about the phone call, about whether anyone would actually listen to the message. Maybe they got calls like that all the time. People trying to scam them, pretending they had something important just to get attention. What if they didn't believe him? Morning came and there was no response. The day stretched long, filled with school and thoughts that refused to leave his mind. By the time he returned home, he felt exhausted from waiting. He had almost convinced himself that no one would ever call back when suddenly Doña Maria knocked on their door. "Someone called for you," she said, holding out the phone. Juan took it quickly. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered. "Is this Juan?" "Yes," he said, his grip tightening on the phone. "This is Emily. I work with Shaquille O'Neal's team. You left a message saying you found his wallet?" "Yes," Juan repeated, feeling his heart race. "It's here. I didn't take anything from it, I promise." The woman on the other end chuckled. "I believe you, kid. Mr. O'Neal did lose his wallet, and we've been trying to figure out where he might have dropped it. He'll be very happy to hear you found it." Relief flooded through Juan's chest. "So, how do I get it back to him?" "We'd like to arrange a meeting," Emily said. "Would you and your family be comfortable meeting him somewhere safe?" Juan glanced at his mother, who had been listening carefully. She nodded, giving him permission to say yes. "Yeah, that would be okay." "Great. Let me check with him and get back to you with a time and place." When Juan hung up, he turned to Lucia, barely able to contain his excitement. "They're going to set up a meeting. I'm really going to give it back to him." Lucia smiled, ruffling his hair. "I told you doing the right thing would matter." Later that evening, Emily called again with details. The meeting was set for the next day in a public park not too far from their neighborhood. Juan barely had time to process it before exhaustion finally caught up with him. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts raced between nerves and excitement. He had no idea how much his life was about to change. The next morning, Juan woke up before the sun had fully risen, the early light casting long shadows through the thin curtains of their apartment. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, wondering if yesterday's conversation had been a dream. But the weight of the wallet on the table reminded him that it was real. A nervous excitement ran through him as he sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Today was the day. He was going to meet Shaquille O'Neal. The thought felt unreal, like something that happened to other people, not to a kid from a neighborhood like his. Lucia was already awake, moving quietly around the kitchen as she prepared breakfast. The scent of warm tortillas and scrambled eggs filled the apartment, a rare but welcome meal. She turned when she saw him, a small smile on her face. "Eat something," she said. "You don't want to go on an empty stomach." Juan sat at the table, but his appetite was overshadowed by nerves. His mother must have noticed because she set down her plate and rested a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens today," she said gently, "I want you to remember something. You did the right thing. That's what matters most." He nodded, though part of him still felt uncertain. What if Shaquille O'Neal barely noticed? What if he just took the wallet and left? Juan wasn't expecting a reward, but he couldn't shake the thought that maybe this whole thing wouldn't be as important as it felt to him. After breakfast, Lucia helped him pick out something decent to wear, his cleanest pair of jeans and a button-up shirt that was slightly too big but still presentable. Carla, still too young to fully understand why today was special, tugged at his sleeve as he was getting ready. "Can I come too?" she asked, looking up at him with wide eyes. Lucia knelt down beside her. "Not today, mi amor, but Juan will tell you all about it when he gets back." Carla pouted but didn't argue. Juan gave her a quick hug before stepping outside with his mother. The sun was higher now, casting warm light over the neighborhood, but the air still held the crispness of morning. They took the bus to the park where the meeting had been arranged. It wasn't far, but the ride felt longer than usual, every stop stretching the minutes as Juan's anticipation grew. He kept glancing out the window, watching as the city passed by, a mix of towering buildings and crumbling storefronts, the wealthier district seeming like a different world from the one he knew. When they arrived, he spotted a black SUV parked near the entrance. A few people stood nearby, scanning the area, and Juan felt his stomach tighten. This was really happening. Lucia placed a reassuring hand on his back. "Ready?" He nodded, though his heart was pounding. They stepped into the park, walking along the paved path toward the open clearing where the meeting had been set. Families were scattered around, some sitting on benches, others watching their children play on the swings and slides. It was an ordinary scene, yet today, for Juan, everything felt heightened, as if the world had turned its attention to this one moment. And then he saw him. Even from a distance, Shaquille O'Neal was impossible to miss. He stood tall, towering over everyone around him, dressed casually in a dark hoodie and jeans, his massive hands tucked into his pockets. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards or an entourage, just a few people who seemed to be the part of his team. He looked relaxed, but when his gaze landed on Juan, a warm smile spread across his face. Juan swallowed hard. He had never met anyone famous before, and Shaq wasn't just famous, he was a legend. As they approached, Shaquille stepped forward, his presence alone commanding attention. But instead of feeling intimidating, there was something about him that put Juan at ease. "You must be Juan," Shaq said, his deep voice carrying easily over the park noise. Juan nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Shaq grinned. No need for sir. Just Shaq is fine. Juan hesitated, then reached into his bag and carefully pulled out the wallet. Here it is, he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. I didn't take anything from it. Shaquille took the wallet, opening it briefly to check inside. After a moment, he looked back at Juan, his expression unreadable. Then, to Juan's surprise, he laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that made the tension in Juan's chest ease just a little. Everything's here, Shaq said, even the cash. You know how rare that is? Juan didn't know what to say, so he just shrugged. It wasn't mine to take. Shaquille nodded, slipping the wallet into his pocket. That tells me a lot about you, kid. He glanced at Lucia, his expression softening. And about how you were raised. Lucia smiled, though she looked just as overwhelmed as Juan felt. Shaquille crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Juan's height. Can I ask you something? Juan nodded. You could have kept it, Shaq said. No one would have known. And I'm guessing things aren't easy for you and your family. Juan hesitated, then nodded again. They're not. So, why did you bring it back? The question was simple, but Juan had to think about it. He had asked himself the same thing so many times since finding the wallet. In the end, the answer was the same. My mom always says we should do the right thing, he said finally, even when no one's watching. Shaquille smiled, and there was something in his expression, something beyond gratitude, beyond admiration. It was understanding. I like that, he said. You're a good kid, Juan. Juan felt warmth spread through his chest. He had expected Shaquille O'Neal to be grateful, maybe to shake his hand. But this felt different. It felt like being seen, really seen, in a way he hadn't expected. Shaquille stood up and turned to Lucia. You should be proud, he said. I am, she answered without hesitation. For a moment, the conversation settled into silence. Then, as if making up his mind about something, Shaquille glanced at his team before looking back at Juan. You know, he said, I don't just want to say thank you and leave it at that. Juan frowned slightly. What do you mean? Shaq smiled. I mean, I'd like to do something for you and your family. Juan blinked. He hadn't expected that. Shaquille turned to one of the people from his team. We'll talk details later, but I want to see what we can do for them. Lucia started to shake her head. Oh, you don't have to. I know, I don't have to, Shaq interrupted gently. I want to. He looked back at Juan. You didn't ask for anything. You did this because it was right. That's the kind of person we need more of. Juan didn't know what to say. He felt like he had just stepped into someone else's life, like this wasn't really happening to him. But it was, and it was only the beginning. The bus ride home was quiet. Juan sat by the window, staring out at the city as it passed in blurred flashes of concrete and neon. His mind was too full to focus on any one thought for long. Everything that had happened at the park felt unreal, like a story he had read in a book rather than something he had actually lived through. His mother sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't said much since they had left the park, but there was a different kind of silence between them now. Not the heavy, tired quiet that usually settled over their evenings, but something lighter, something hopeful. When they stepped off the bus and made their way through the familiar streets toward their apartment, Lucia finally spoke. He meant what he said, she murmured. Juan glanced up at her. Who? She gave him a look as if the answer was obvious. Shaquille O'Neal. Juan hesitated. You really think so? Lucia nodded. People like him, they don't say things they don't mean. He didn't have to offer to help. He could have just taken the wallet and left. Juan thought about that. It was true. Shaq had already thanked him, already acknowledged what he had done. He didn't owe them anything. And yet, when he had looked at Juan, there had been something in his eyes, something beyond simple gratitude. A decision had been made in that moment, one that Juan still didn't fully understand. That night, when Juan lay in bed, the weight of the day finally caught up to him. The nervousness, the excitement, the shock. His body ached with exhaustion, but his mind refused to settle. He thought of his mother's words, of Shaquille O'Neal's promise. And then, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe things really could change. The next morning, life resumed as usual, at least for a little while. Juan went to school, though focusing on his lessons was nearly impossible. Every time his thoughts drifted, they circled back to the meeting in the park. The moment replayed in his mind like a scene from a movie, one that didn't quite feel like his own. He didn't tell anyone at school what had happened. It wasn't that he didn't want to, it was that he wasn't sure how to put it into words. Would anyone even believe him? By the time he got home that afternoon, the apartment was filled with the smell of something rich and warm, something he couldn't quite place at first. He stepped inside and found Lucia standing by the stove, stirring a pot of what looked like real soup, thicker, heartier than anything they'd had in weeks. On the counter sat a bag of groceries, and next to it, a folded piece of paper. Juan set his backpack down. Where did this come from? Lucia turned, her eyes still holding that quiet disbelief. Shaquille's team. Juan blinked. Already? She nodded. They called this morning, asked for our address. Then, an hour later, someone knocked on the door and left these. She gestured to the groceries, then picked up the paper. And this. Juan stepped closer. It wasn't just a note. It was a letter. It was printed on heavy paper with a neat, professional font. But it wasn't cold or formal. It was personal. Shaq had written it himself. Lucia, I meant what I said yesterday. Your son is a rare kind of person, and the way you've raised him says a lot about you. I know that times have been hard, and I want to help. This is just a start. My team will be reaching out soon with something more permanent. Until then, take care. Shaquille Juan read it twice, then looked up at his mother. What does he mean by something more permanent? Lucia exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath since the groceries arrived. I don't know, she admitted. But Juan, I think this is only the beginning. She was right. The next week was a whirlwind. It started with a phone call. Emily, the woman from Shaquille's team, reached out again, this time asking for more details about Lucia's work situation. She listened carefully as Lucia explained how she cleaned houses during the day and worked in the corner store at night. She didn't complain, didn't ask for anything, but the reality of their life was laid bare in her words. A few days later, another call came. This time, it wasn't just Emily. It was Shaq himself. Lucia nearly dropped the phone when she realized who was on the other end. Juan watched as she pressed the device to her ear, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. She thanked him, over and over, until finally, Shaq said something that made her stop mid-sentence. I've spoken to some people, he told her. There's a position opening up at a company I trust. It's stable, better pay, benefits. If you're interested, it's yours. Lucia didn't respond right away. Her hands shook slightly as she held the phone, her mouth opening and closing as if the words refused to come. Juan had never seen her look so stunned. Finally, she whispered, I don't know what to say. Just say yes, Shaq said, his voice warm. And so she did. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Within 2 weeks, Lucia was training for her new job, a position that offered stability for the first time in years. The late-night shifts at the corner store were gone. The constant stress of overdue bills began to ease, and that was only part of it. Shaquille's generosity didn't stop at securing a job for Lucia. His team ensured that the family was supported in ways they hadn't expected. Rent was covered for the next few months, giving them time to catch up without the looming fear of eviction. New clothes arrived for Carla and Juan, replacing the worn hand-me-downs they had long since outgrown. And then, one afternoon, an invitation came. Shaq wanted them to visit him on the set of a commercial he was filming in the city. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a VIP experience, something they never could have imagined being a part of. When they arrived, Juan felt as though he had stepped into another world. The lights, the cameras, the bustling crew, it was all so different from anything he had ever known. Shaquille greeted them like old friends, introducing them to the people around him, making sure they felt welcome. Then, at the end of the visit, he handed Lucia another envelope. Inside was an official job offer from the company he had arranged for her to work with. But there was more. A handwritten note, just like the first. Lucia, this is for you, for your family, for the future you've worked so hard to give your kids. You don't owe me anything. This is what you deserve. And Juan, he's going to do great things. I can see it. Shaquille Lucia wiped at her eyes as she read it, her fingers trembling slightly. Juan stood beside her, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. A simple act of honesty had started a chain reaction. He hadn't expected anything in return. He hadn't done it for a reward. But somehow doing the right thing had changed everything. The change in their lives happened so quickly that at times it felt like a dream. One day, Juan and his mother were struggling to make ends meet, their future uncertain, their worries endless. And then, because of a single moment of honesty, their world shifted in ways neither of them could have ever imagined. Lucia started her new job at the company Shaquille had arranged for her. The first few days were nerve-wracking for her. She had never worked in an office before, never sat at a desk, or used a computer beyond the old, slow machine at the corner store where she used to work the night shift. But her employers were patient, understanding. They knew her story. They knew why she was there. And for the first time in years, she felt valued. Juan noticed the change in her almost immediately. The exhaustion that had once clung to her like a second skin began to lift. She still worked hard, she always would, but there was a new energy to her, a new kind of hope in her eyes. She no longer came home looking defeated, her shoulders weighed down by the endless struggle of trying to provide for her family with nothing but sheer determination. The rent was covered for a while, but even when that support ended, Lucia's new salary was enough to keep them afloat. There was food in the fridge now, real food, not just rice and beans stretched out to last as long as possible. Carla had new shoes that actually fit her feet, and Juan no longer had to pretend that his school supplies would last another year when they were already falling apart. But it wasn't just their lives that changed. The story of Juan's honesty had started to spread. It began with a single video. A woman sitting in the park that day, one of the many people who had stopped to watch the unusual sight of a towering basketball legend speaking to an ordinary boy, had recorded a part of the interaction on her phone. She had captured the moment Juan handed the wallet back to Shaq, the way Shaq had laughed in disbelief at the untouched cash, the way he had crouched down to speak to Juan at eye level like they were equals. The woman posted the video on social media that night, thinking little of it beyond the fact that it was a heartwarming moment in a world that often felt too harsh. By the next morning, it had gone viral. People across the country, across the world, were sharing it, commenting on it, debating it. Some praised Juan for his honesty, saying that stories like his were proof that good still existed. Others focused on Lucia, saying that she was the true hero for raising a child with such integrity despite their hardships. And, of course, there were those who questioned it all. Some said it was just luck that Juan had stumbled into an opportunity that wouldn't have existed if the wallet had belonged to an ordinary person instead of a celebrity. Others argued that people did good deeds every day, but weren't rewarded for them, that it was unfair how attention worked. But the overwhelming response was one of admiration. News stations picked up the story, running segments about Juan and his family. They interviewed neighbors, teachers, people who had known them before all of this happened. They talked about how honesty was a choice, about how easy it would have been for Juan to keep the money, to take the chance at a better life the wrong way. And then the discussion shifted. Schools began using Juan's story as an example in ethics lessons. Teachers asked their students what they would have done in his place. Parents shared the story with their children, using it to explain why honesty mattered, why doing the right thing wasn't always the easiest path, but was always the most important one. The ripple effect continued. Organizations dedicated to helping underprivileged children took notice. They reached out to Juan's family, offering scholarships, resources, support. They wanted to show other kids like him that honesty, integrity, and kindness weren't just ideals. They could change lives. Shaquille, moved by the impact of Juan's actions, took it even further. He announced plans to start a new charity initiative aimed at supporting low-income families, focusing on education, mentorship, and opportunities for children who, like Juan, had the potential for greatness, but not always the means to reach it. He spoke about Juan in interviews not as a boy who had returned a wallet, but as a symbol of something larger. "It's not about the money," he said in one interview. "It's about character, about who you are when no one's watching. Juan reminded me of that. And if one kid can make this kind of impact, imagine what we can do if we all start thinking that way." Juan watched all of this unfold with a strange mixture of disbelief and quiet pride. He had never wanted attention, never expected anything to come from his decision beyond knowing he had done the right thing. But somehow that one moment had grown into something bigger than himself, something that stretched beyond his neighborhood, beyond his city, beyond anything he could have imagined. One day, weeks after everything had started, Juan was walking home from school when he noticed a group of younger kids whispering and pointing at him. At first, he felt self-conscious. He still wasn't used to people knowing who he was. Then, one of the kids, maybe 10 years old, approached him hesitantly. "Are you the kid from the video?" Juan paused, then nodded. "Yeah." The boy bit his lip, glancing at his friends before looking back at Juan. "That was cool," he said. "My mom told me about it. She said I should always do the right thing, even if no one's watching." Juan felt warmth spread through his chest. "She's right," he said. The boy grinned, then ran back to his friends. Juan stood there for a moment, watching them go, realizing for the first time that his story, his choice, had become more than just something that had changed his own life. It had changed others, too. Later that evening, as he sat at the dinner table with his mother and sister, eating a meal that no longer felt like a struggle, he thought back to the day he had found the wallet. He thought about how different things could have been if he had made another choice. But he hadn't. And because of that, because of one honest decision, the future looked brighter than it ever had before. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more inspiring tales. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Watch the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss it.